Hello and welcome to Wilson Center Now, a production of the Woodrow Wilson International Center for Scholars. I'm John Molesky. My guest today is Robert Daly. Robert is director of the Wilson Center's Kissinger Institute on China and the United States. And as luck would have it, he's just come back from a trip to China. Welcome back, Robert, and thanks for joining us. Just some impressions of your recent trip to mainland China.
Well, I was at a big conference. It's a once-a-year conference out there, which they move out of the city of Beijing, so you don't get to see China, into a satellite city in a huge conference center that is beautiful, but that functions a little bit like a prison. So there's not much out there.
Yeah.
And there were some worthwhile conversations, but what really struck me was that they framed it with really bellicose, anti-American public lectures of, I thought, a particularly sort of noxious variety. I was seated in the front, and you can't applaud for these things. And after one of them, the head of the conference actually came down and said he'd noted that I hadn't applauded and he hoped he hadn't offended me. But it was clearly they're off the leash in terms of public presentations and attacks on the United States.
Just generic attacks?
Of a sort that I hadn't
about
seen.
the trade wars?
There was one that was, sort of mostly about the trade war, and the second one was mostly about the United States and Taiwan. But it's an old style, truth through volume, Communist Party rhetorical style among people who don't otherwise speak that way. And I say that it seems it's the kind of speech you would get, especially framing a major conference. That it would seem to be almost a deliberate decision that this was going to be the public face, because there were a lot of Chinese journalists, Chinese and only Chinese journalists allowed to attend.
Well, that would be my guess. There's not freelancing going on here, right? This is orchestrated.
This is orchestrated. This comes out of a certain, both a policy inclination and a cultural tradition in China.
So who is the audience? Is it a domestic audience or an international audience?
It was mostly domestic. There were internationals there. I think that one could ask, if one were inclined to be cynical, of course we're not at the Wilson Center, that some of the foreigners might have been there for show, to have what the Chinese call floral vases. But
so you were a prop?
I might have been a prop for some of these things, but we had the former Prime Minister of Bosnia-Herzegovina, one of the best name cards I've ever received, from very well-spoken gentleman. I went to congratulate him on his speech, and his title was Emeritus Librarian of Alexandria. So they brought people in from all over the world, but there was a little bit of, I think, use of them as stage props.
One of the things I was planning to ask you today is, because you and I were in an internal discussion at the Wilson Center this week, where there was this discussion of the great powers competition, and this idea that, what is the designation? Is it a sort of a friendly competitor? Is
Right.
it, what? And I was going to ask you from the Chinese perspective, what is the United States, and vice versa. And I get a sense that that may be evolving rapidly in the last several months.
It is, and what I found on this last trip to China is that in public-facing discussions like we had, China is still playing the surprised, innocent, passive victim. The pose, and this is not what you hear in private. In private conversations, many Chinese scholars of the relationship will say that the fundamental change in the relationship was the change in China. As China became more assertive under Xi Jinping, that was the geostrategic change that caused a reaction in the United States. Among the expert community, you hear that. But the public posture, and the Chinese media says, no, this is something that was visited suddenly by the Trump administration, which launched a trade war on a passive, innocent, surprised, and confused China, which doesn't know how to respond because of the inconsistency of the American administration. So that is what is presented to the Chinese people. Privately, there are a great many very sophisticated, practiced observers there who know that it's more complicated than that.
Mm-hmm. And from the U.S. perspective, is China now the enemy?
Well, I think we haven't really called it yet. We've been moving in that direction. The National Security Strategy, of course, 2017, said that China and Russia are our greatest long-term strategic concerns and are a bigger concern than terrorism. That has since been supported by the National Defense Strategy. And Donald Trump, in one of his recent tweets, called Xi Jinping, albeit slightly indirectly, an enemy for the first time. And it was in the form of who's the greater enemy, Xi Jinping or Jay Powell of the Federal Reserve. Now, that's something that I think most of us would read it and would ascribe that to simple Trumpian rhetoric. We wouldn't take it terribly seriously, because it's clearly somewhat tongue-in-cheek, even for this administration. But you cannot unsay that in the international sphere. Once you've uttered the word enemy, That's out there. And no subsequent number of declarations that Xi Jinping is your close, respected friend and a brilliant leader help you to unsay enemy, which lands a lot more harshly on the ear in China than it does here.
So one of the conventional wisdom assumptions in discussing the global economy in recent years has been that China is the growth juggernaut.
Right.
Has the trade wars created a speed bump?
Well, it's a little bit hard to disaggregate. The trade war has clearly had an impact on China. And they would very much like it to go away. And President Trump is right that they would like to make a deal. Of course, parenthetically, they want to make a deal on their terms, which are very different from ours.
Who doesn't?
Right, but it's a little bit hard. Before President Trump came into office, China had already launched a very deliberate transition in the domestic economy aimed toward moving up the manufacturing chain, moving up the value chain. They don't want to just assemble components manufactured overseas and export them anymore. They want to actually design those components. They are focused more on the domestic service industry and on domestic consumption, and have actually been planning for a slowdown in growth. They want higher quality, slower, more sustainable growth. They know that the go-go years are more or less over. And so it's very difficult to tell. It's probably difficult even for the Chinese to tell how much of the slowdown can be attributed to the trade war and how much of it is a result of domestic factors that were in play before President Trump. And I'm not sure we have an answer to that yet. It's too soon.
Speaking of conventional wisdom, on the notion of what the motivations are on either side to strike a deal, how much urgency they're feeling is that President Trump is in a hurry because he's got an election staring him in the face, while President Xi, president for life, can wait it out.
I think the conventional wisdom is more or less correct on this one. The Chinese understand the American election cycle very well, and I think they also know that President Trump watches the stock market, watches his approval ratings among the American working class and agriculturalists, and also that he watches signs of a recession, any of which would threaten re-election chances. Therefore, China can wait it out and will wait for America to come back for a Chinese-style deal. What does that mean? A Chinese-style deal means purchases. You order more Boeing planes, you order more soybeans, you order whatever it may be. Purchases and promises to do better in the future at a time of China's deciding. And this has been typical of the sorts of promises that were given to President Obama and George W. Bush, is that, of course, China is on a path of continued opening and reform, and they will someday get there. I don't know if you ever saw the old Clint Eastwood movie, The Outlaw Josie Wales.
I did.
And if you remember the Chief Dan George character, the Cherokee, who is told by Ulysses S. Grant to endeavor to persevere. And the Chinese promises have that quality to them. We will endeavor to persevere, to continue to open up and reform our economy. And the Chinese hope is that promises and purchases of that kind will be enough for President Trump to declare victory and move on, with the president obviously hoping then for a lasting bump in the stock market and to avoid a recession. And I think that is the Chinese read.
And now I can check a box because we always try to get a movie reference.
We've done it.
So
We've done it.
Do that. But a subcategory, an issue related to the economy is that we haven't revisited for a while is the Huawei situation.
Right.
What is an update on that?
Well, I think that a lot of this has become sort of stalemated. There haven't been any major new developments in the Huawei case. What we have done since I think the last time we spoke is we've come out fairly strongly in support of Canada on this and have been very critical of China's hostage taking. After Meng Wanzhou, the daughter of the founder of Huawei and the COO or CIO of Huawei, was arrested at our request in Canada, in Vancouver, under an extradition request. China really took two hostages, and our government was fairly quiet about that for a long time. And Canada has felt, not unreasonably, that in the Canada, U.S., China triangle, Canada is the least blameworthy and is paying the highest price. And so we have, since we last spoke, stepped up and have said that this hostage taking is regrettable and have stood more firmly by Canada's side. But this doesn't really change the game at all. And both Trump in his way and Xi Jinping in his way have linked the disposition of the Huawei case, at least to the Meng Wanzhou case, to the outcome in the trade negotiations. So this remains a big question mark.
What about the bottom line aspect of this? Is Huawei wounded as a global entity, a global business?
Sure, it is on the entity list. We have told some American companies that they can continue to do certain limited kinds of business with Huawei, but exemptions have not been given to a number of other companies. So we do have the ability, by cutting off supply of basic components and chips to Huawei, to cripple, if not finish, major aspects of its business. But Huawei is also a major customer for Qualcomm and other American multinationals that need Huawei's business. And so this is far from over. I mean, the question really is whether, with regards to trade or tech or Huawei, whether we should be speaking of deals or resolutions at all, or if these are simply going to be long-term stalemates and components of a new normal that are an ongoing irritant to both governments, which is a perfectly likely medium-term outcome.
How long will it take for us to know that?
I think it will take us into 2020. I think that, as we've mentioned, if President Trump really thinks he needs to end the trade war to secure re-election, that we will see him accept a deal on Chinese terms, purchases and promises. He will then be able to claim, I think rightly, that he has brought more attention to this issue than any of his predecessors, and perhaps that he's wrested more concessions from China than any of his predecessors. We would have to see. But he will certainly fail to get the maximalist goals that he defined at the outset, what they call the structural goals of getting China to really fundamentally change its treatment of foreign intellectual property and to codify that into Chinese law, to cease its subsidies to its state-owned enterprises, to be more open and reciprocal generally, and to cut down other kinds of non-tariff barriers that weaken the access of American corporations to China's market. That China will not do. But those are the maximalist goals that we have defined. They are willing to do something less than that, that will give President Trump probably more than any of his predecessors got.
I want to pull back the curtain a bit for those of you watching and listening. And normally when we invite Robert or any guests to Wilson Center Now, there's this particular issue we want to focus on. In this case, we decided we're going to do a
ramble.
We're going to catch up on a bunch of major issues and stories that we haven't spoken about for a couple months. So one of those is the Belt and Road Initiative. What's the update on how that's working out for China?
The Belt and Road Initiative continues, from China's point of view, sort of full speed ahead. They're continuing to make loans all over Eurasia, and of course they also regard development lending in South America and the Caribbean, in Africa as part of Belt and Road. Indeed, they describe their activities in the polar regions as part of the Belt and Road as well. They are still struggling toward a kind of Belt and Road 2.0 because, as we discussed previously, there had been a lot of blowback against certain modes of Chinese lending, but they remain one of the major sources of capacity in the world. Even with the hits that they have taken because of the trade war, they're the world's #1 trading nation. Through the new development bank, the Asian Infrastructure Investment Bank, they continue to make resources available in parts of the world where the Asian Development Bank, the World Bank, the IMF are very hesitant to get involved. And so even though there is growing awareness, I think, of the risks of Belt and Road lending, people continue to take it. For example, I was speaking just earlier this week with a South American diplomat who was concerned about the conditionality of Chinese loans. He comes from a nation that has
strings attached,
a number of development loans. And what they found since those development loans came into effect is that every year when the Falun Gong, which is a banned a religious group from China that is banned in China, but it's active all over the world. And Falun Gong has a song and dance production called the Shenyun Ballet, or whatever it is. You see it advertised on the metro in Washington, D.C.
Yes.
They're all over the world. And it's very much a propaganda piece aimed against the Communist Party and that highlights some of the atrocities that are said to have been perpetrated against the Falun Gong. But in this South American country, as here at the Kennedy Center, they book venues and they run their program, and people go to see dancing and kung fu and this sort of thing. Mm-hmm. Now, every year, when they've booked that into their otherwise free performing arts venues, the Chinese government comes down very hard and says that they are not to perform. And it's always very clearly implicit that China has the right to veto performances because of the lending. And in fact, the diplomat said he's very concerned that his country takes those conditions and will not let Shenyun in. Now, that's one small example, but there is conditionality to Belt and Road lending. Many countries bristle against it, but they also need the resources.
But it may be a small aspect, but it points to a larger consideration, which is sort of the soft power question,
right,
where China has this acute awareness of soft power, and generally it seems to manifest in some sort of censorship impulse. What about China's influence growing in a more positive way through soft power? Is that in the cards?
Well, I think it's not in the cards in the determinedly free and developed world. They are making inroads, however, in Africa, in parts of South America, in parts of Central Asia, where they are the only lender to which these nations have recourse. And so when you come in with a port or an airport or a highway or a rail line, many nations are willing to accept Chinese conditions. They get real benefits from these in many cases, or at least important interest groups within some of those countries do. And they are then more open to things like CGTN, the Chinese Global Television Network, which used to be called, CCTV, China Central Television.
Yeah.
I've already forgotten the acronym. Here in Washington, and they have a 24/7 English language news broadcast, which is very welcome and therefore very influential in parts of the world like Africa. So they're not making soft power inroads in the United States or Canada, Japan or South Korea or Europe, but in other parts of the world that are developing rapidly, they're actually doing quite well.
Are they investing in pop culture?
Less. In fact, I'm
as
not
a calling card to the world.
They're not doing it, for example, the way the South Koreans are, where South Korean, boy bands and girl bands like Blackpink. My 6th grade daughter, she and her friends, this is their favorite band, and neither my daughter nor her friend speaks Korean. This is new in the United States. This would have been unthinkable 10 or 15 years ago, that a Korean boy band that sings in Korean would be a huge hit on Saturday Night Live. The South Koreans are very successful.
The Beatles of 2019.
Right. Well, let's not quite give them that yet. But China has had no successes of that kind.
Yeah. So I haven't brought up, and we haven't spoken previously because it all exploded in the time that we hadn't had one of these chats, is Hong Kong.
Right.
What are you hearing when you're in China about Hong Kong, and how patient is China willing to be?
I think China is a little bit more patient than a lot of the American media are giving them credit for. To read the American media, because there are large contingents of the People's Armed Police who are up on the in Shenzhen, right on the northern Hong Kong border, and they're conducting some public exercises, which, yes, are designed to intimidate, and some of these include tank exercises, this sort of thing. There's a tendency here to think that this is going to be a second Tiananmen, and it's often presented as though China is champing at the bit to go into Hong Kong. I do not think that is true. China clearly understands that it would pay a major price if it resorted to violence within Hong Kong. It would end Hong Kong's special status, but most importantly, it would make it clear that one country, two systems does not work. And one country, two systems, which is the promise that China made to Hong Kong, was initially the promise, and is still the promise, that China makes to Taiwan, which is a far greater concern than Hong Kong itself. And going into Hong Kong with violence puts the end to one country, two systems, and makes it the day on which China and Taiwan reunite, if that is to ever happen, ever more distant. And Beijing knows this. We tend to describe it in terms of Tiananmen. Beijing described what's going on in Hong Kong as a color revolution. One of the implications is that it's doomed to fail, but another of which is that it's orchestrated by the United States. I just mentioned that I heard some pretty bellicose speeches when I was in China, and one of them included a lengthy attack on the National Endowment for Democracy as sort of one of the black hands that was doing this.
Velvet Revolution type of
that sort of thing. And of course, it's true that the National Endowment for Democracy is active internationally and it wants to promote democracy, but it's sort of a bunch of idealistic Americans in some office here in Washington, D.C., and they're incapable of orchestrating something like the Hong Kong demonstrations, which are clearly a native, unled, more or less organic movement of young people who want to have a better and a more.
Does China
free future.
understand that, or in other words, is it simply propaganda or promoting a conspiracy theory with international
No,
forces?
I don't think it's merely that. It's true that this is a constant part of the Communist Party playbook, because you cannot admit that these are the genuine feelings of people who are supposed to be within China's embrace. That is inadmissible. So there must be an explanation, so you reach for foreign manipulation. But I think that a lot of people in China also really believe it. And there have been some aspects of the Hong Kong protests. For example, last weekend, they went with American flags to the American consulate in Hong Kong, waved flags, sang the American national anthem, and had slogans like, "Save us, President Trump." This clearly plays into the hands of the Beijing propagandists who want to say that this is manipulated by the United States. And that is very much the story, I think, that the Chinese Communist Party tells itself to a considerable degree, but it's also a story that through the party-run media it tells to the Chinese people. And I think there's a considerable amount of buy-in to this, is they give us credit for far too much competence when it comes to manipulating Chinese people to want to subvert Beijing. But that remains sort of central to China's explanation of what's going on.
We've covered a lot of ground, and I'm going to end with one of my favorite interview questions that I learned from a 60 Minutes producer, which the notion is when you're talking to an expert who knows a hell of a lot more than you should ask this question to cover yourself, which is there anything I haven't asked you about today that is important for our viewers to know?
Well, China, it's almost every single week has brought another turn of the wheel in U.S.-China relations. And I think that one of the lessons learned, and I'm talking here more specifically about the trade war, because every time we get a positive sounding or positive noise, no matter how vague from Beijing or Washington, the stock markets have an irrational response on the positive side. And every time there's another negative tweet, they drop 600 points. And it's been striking over the past year and a half to watch this schizoid response of the market, which proves that the wizards of Wall Street, the masters of the universe, have no understanding of the broad direction of this relationship or what's going on and the ways in which it has become a contentious relationship and will remain so even if there's a so-called deal. So just to end on a small point, do not base your sense of the health of the U.S.-China economic relations on what's going on Wall Street. It's been very much detached from it.
It's almost the illusion that it's a mathematical equation when in fact it's human reaction to things.
Right, and some of this is algorithmic buying and selling, but it's not all that.
Yeah. Well, Robert, thank you. As always, a lot of fun and an education.
Thank
Thanks
you,
for joining
sir.
us.
Yep.
Thank you as well. Hope you enjoyed this edition of Wilson Center Now and that you'll join us again soon. Until then, for all of us at the Wilson Center, I'm John Molesky. Thanks for joining us.